우리 행정실 시작해 주세요. Professor Gu, please open your video so you can start the roundtable.
Okay, good morning and good evening and to all of our participants. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Freedom House and the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies of Busan University of Foreign Studies. Today's topic is Beijing's media influence in Southeast Asia. My name is Gu Bo-kyung, a research professor from KIAS. Now, I would like to invite Professor Kim Dong-yeol, Director of Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies of Busan University of Foreign Studies, to deliver his opening remarks. Please welcome him.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gu. Good morning. I'm Dong-yeol Kim, Director of Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies. I would like to thank my fellow colleagues and friends at home and abroad for attending this second KIAS ASEAN briefing. Above all, I would like to thank Sarah Cook, Research Director, and Bo Chen Han, Research Associate from Freedom House, for co-hosting this roundtable. And I also like to thank the three researchers who will introduce their research outputs, and the three Korean professors who share their time to join this roundtable as discussant. As for a little background of this roundtable, Freedom House conducted a survey research from 2019 to 2021 over 30 countries of the world under the topic of Beijing's Global Media Influence 2022. Out of research outputs, the cases of the three ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, will be presented and discussed in this roundtable. As we all witness today, the global community has faced many difficulties. The prolonged COVID-19 pandemic and economic difficulties derived from it, food and energy problems caused by the Russia and Ukraine war, and climate change due to the global warming are driving international relations further into tension and crisis. On the other hand, China's recent emergence as a global power and the US response to check it even make international society driving into a new Cold War. As such, under the competition between the big powers, the ASEAN region holds a geopolitical significance. ASEAN is located at the cross-section of China's major foreign policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the US Indo-Pacific strategy to check and balance the Chinese initiative. So the ASEAN region is an area where the conflict of interests are concentrated between and among the global powers. In the area of international relations, international interest comes first at carrying out foreign policies of any countries. Particularly, the global leading countries strive to further solidify their international status by employing possible means and methods that can be applied. Forming friendly public opinion in the international community plays an important role in strengthening their positions. For this reason, the investment in the global media sector by the big powers can be seen as natural. Therefore, It is totally depending on the state and the people, whether they protect their sense of independence and integrity by responding properly to the possible disinformation from the outside of their borders. Among ASEAN members, the three countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, seem to maintain a neutral position in the power competition between the United States and China as much as possible. In case of the Philippines, although the last Duterte administration seemed to adopt pro-China policy, it is still wonder whether the pro-China policy will continue under the current Marcos administration. The Philippines is traditionally an ally of the United States, and the Filipinos' public policy on China is constantly unfavorable due to many reasons, particularly the maritime territorial dispute over the Philippine West Sea. Malaysia and Indonesia also protesting against China's arbitrary claim over the South China Sea. In addition, the Muslim conflict in China's Xinjiang Uyghur region is regarded as a suppression of Islam by the Chinese government, which makes the Malaysian and Indonesian Muslim public opinion to China unfavorable. Upon this background, it raises questions about how effective China's efforts to spread media influence in the three countries are. It is also meaningful that this roundtable on this issue held in Korea, not in China or ASEAN countries, since Korea is a third party in the same East Asian region. Understanding and engaging in the China-ASEAN relations by Korea would be a constructive effort to build a peaceful and prosperous East Asian regions. I hope that this roundtable will be a venue to understand more about the East Asian regional issues. And finally, I wish everyone attending this webinar would have a meaningful and fruitful time. Thank you very much, and good morning and good evening.
Okay, thank you, Director Kim, for your remarks. Now, I'd like to introduce Sarah Ku. She is a research director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. Sarah Ku directs the China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest in English and Chinese, providing news and analysis on media freedom developments related to China. Please welcome Sarah Ku.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for joining us and organizing this discussion. For those of you who aren't familiar with Freedom House, it's actually one of the oldest human rights organizations in the United States. And since 1941, Freedom House has been working to advance freedom and democracy globally. And I think looking at, this particular project and the topic we're talking about today, even as a US organization, of course, we may look at things from a certain perspective, but really at the core for Freedom House is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think when we're talking about, Chinese and Communist Party influence and interacting with different countries, for this study, we really did focus on democracies, on countries that are rated by Freedom House as free or partly free, with the idea of looking and engaging with individuals locally in terms of how do they see the efforts from the Chinese Communist Party, infringing. To what extent is it infringing on press freedom? Is it veering in a direction that is not just about telling China's story, which of course any country from a public diplomacy perspective is important, but where does it start to veer in a more kind of covert and coercive and problematic and authoritarian direction? And so in this context, I'm very pleased to be moderating this conversation on this new report we published. It's called Beijing's Global Media Influence. and has two dimensions: authoritarian expansion and the power of democratic resilience. So it was kind of nice working on China and human rights to have a bit of a good story to tell. And our speakers today will speak to some of that. I'll speak a little bit in terms of how we were going to use the time today, very briefly, on some of what we found kind of, from a global perspective and how we really defined and talked about media influence. And then I'll introduce for our four speakers that were researchers on this project. And we'll have a bit of a discussion to share some of the findings on both that influence element coming from Beijing, but also on the perspective of the local response and resilience. And then we'll turn to our Korean colleagues to share their perspectives and insights in responding to the comments from the researchers on the Freedom House project, but also, of course, drawing on their own observations and expertise. And then the last section is really to open it up for a broader discussion and questions and answers. So that was kind of a bit of a layout of how we'll be using the time today. So as Professor Kim mentioned, our research focused on the period of 2019 to 2021. And we looked at Beijing's media influence in 30 countries across 6 regions around the world. And when we talk about media influence, we defined it fairly broadly and from multiple layers. It includes elements of kind of propaganda and pushing out content, Chinese state-produced content, but also elements like disinformation campaigns, censorship and self-censorship, control over infrastructure that's used to disseminate content in different countries, and trainings by Chinese Communist Party affiliated entities for local journalists and officials. And what we did is we actually created a pretty detailed methodology. You can find it on Freedom House's website, along with the full global findings and all of the country case studies. And what we did is we assigned scores for each country on the extent to which they're facing influence efforts from Beijing, but also the degree of response and underlying democratic and media resilience that was present. Through comparing those two scores, we assessed each country as being vulnerable or resilient. And in our sample, actually half of the countries came out resilient, but half of the countries did come out to be vulnerable. So what did we find? Well, we found that Beijing's media influence efforts are intensifying across the world, but also that the tactics being used are becoming more sophisticated, covert, and coercive. On the other hand, we found that pushback is increasing, especially in democracies and among journalists and civil society. And so, as we heard earlier, we actually find that Beijing's efforts are much more mixed in terms of impact on public opinion and really gaining the results they may be seeking when you look at if you just look at, say, the sheer scale of investment. Now, among the 30 countries, we covered 7 in the Asia-Pacific region, including these 3 in Southeast Asia: Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And so on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers, this evening, our time, this morning for you all. Dr. Muhammad Zulfikar Rahma, who's a lecturer in Indonesia, but also, of course, a visiting fellow at the Institute in Korea. Benjamin Loh, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Media and Communications at Taylor's University in Malaysia. And Camila Lemia, a freelance journalist in the Philippines, who's been writing on this topic for quite some time. My colleague, B.C. Han, who co-authored the other country reports, is also going to be joining. So what we'll do is the first round of questions will focus on some of the influence elements and the tactics that were observed. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the response and impact and what we might expect looking forward. So Camille, let's start with you. In the methodology and the ranking we created of these 3 countries, the Philippines actually was found to have the strongest degree of influence efforts coming from Beijing. So maybe you can speak to some of the ways that's played out since 2019.
Right. So when former President Rodrigo Duterte became our president, that began the warming of ties between Manila and Beijing. So it also led to for the longest time, the infrastructure systems in my country, in the Philippines, have always been linked to the American systems or to the American way of doing things. But when Duterte came to power, we saw it like in terms of the state media, they began engaging in closer ties. Like, for example, China would give technical support, would give funding, would also bring several journalists, editors from state media organizations to China. And some of these people would return and kind of parrot the narratives that the Chinese media officials or Chinese state media would say. And at the same time, we also, and on that note, at least 36 journalists from the Philippine media went on a subsidized trip to China since 2019. And I think this is the same thing globally, what they're doing. And also, we noticed that the ambassador himself, the ambassador to the Philippines, has been very active on social media, especially on Facebook, because the Philippines is one of the top social media users in the world. And we would see that the ambassador would use local language, Tagalog, standardized Filipino, and also English. And I would also notice that there would be a lot of commenters, user accounts, but then I didn't go as far as checking if these are legitimate accounts or not. And also the embassy would hold contests online to try to promote Chinese Philippine relationships. And another thing that I noticed, it was the first time ever for a Philippine media organization, a major one at that, to actually have a Chinese language website, news website. It was the first time because the Philippines mostly use Filipinos mostly use English and Tagalog, and it was a surprise for me, even as someone who actually followed this issue, to actually see that there's a separate website for Chinese language. And it's quite interesting too that the media organization didn't really announce this. So I think this is also somehow connected to the public skepticism among Filipinos toward China. And also I noticed that they have been the Chinese state media or the Chinese embassy have been employing influencers to try to propagate their messages. Although this isn't really widespread yet, but it's something that's worth noting because I heard that this is something that's been being used in other Southeast Asian countries like in Myanmar. So mainly that's it. And also the disinformation effort. It's quite difficult for the Philippines to actually spot this because number one, we don't have strong government infrastructure. Our government agencies that are supposed to monitor these, we cannot really expect them to do so because number one, under President Duterte, they have been the main beneficiaries of disinformation efforts. So now under our new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., we have yet to see if this will continue. But yeah, so far, these are the strong influence efforts that Beijing has done or has tried to do in the Philippines.
Thanks, Camille. And I think in the Philippines, there's also this element I think you mentioned of the kind of the inserts of the Chinese state content, especially in some of the more pro-Duterte media, but then you sometimes see it appearing even in other outlets. And that was something that we also saw really around the world, just so much content, just that placement of content that's produced by Chinese state media, making it into mainstream media. And that's really one of the main ways they're reaching large audiences compared to, say, people directly tuning in often to this Chinese state media. Go ahead, Camille, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think another challenge too for Philippine media organizations, because of we are very vulnerable to political attacks. So one factor is that they need more money, like media organizations need more money, and that's why they rely on Chinese embassy sponsored content to fund their operations. Although there are also free inserts, like I think China Daily. Yeah, so those are the things. But there was also pushback when it comes to that. Filipinos tried to oppose these tactics of media organizations. But whether or not it has been effective, well, I'll tell you later.
And so, Muhammad, how would you describe the situation in Indonesia? How does what's happening in the Philippines kind of compare? And again, especially in terms of this dimension of being a Muslim majority country, and of course, the Xinjiang issue being something of a real priority, I think, for the Chinese government there.
Yeah, I think the relationship between Indonesia and China has grown over the recent years, especially after the initiation of the Belt and Road Initiative by Xi Jinping in 2012. And if you see on the map, on the BRI map, Indonesia is a very important point in the map. And of course, Indonesia has a long history of anti-China sentiment, rooted from the anti-communist movement in 1960, and today the sentiment keeps growing, mainly due to the Chinese policy in the Xinjiang issue. And I think because China has a lot of economic interest in Indonesia, China sees that it is very important to maintain its positive image among the Indonesian people, right? To maintain its positive image. That's why I think China's media influence in Indonesia has been mainly targeted to amplify Chinese narrative with particular focus on the Xinjiang issue, as well as on how the Belt and Road Initiative could not only benefit Indonesia, but also not only benefit China, but also benefit Indonesia. And the way China is doing this, the way China trying to spread influence through media is first by expanding physical presence. So several Chinese media have established their offices in Indonesia, such as Hai Indo Channel and several other media. Xinhua has also Twitter account in Bahasa Indonesia with I think 65,000 followers, and they often tell positive narrative about China. And one thing about Xinhua is that they have actually recruited Indonesian journalists to report on China. And then another thing is that many of the Chinese media have also signed partnership with Indonesian media in terms of content sharing agreement, like between Antara News and Xinhua, and then Media Indonesia with China Daily and Xinhua, I think. So many of the reports from this Chinese state media are often reposted in Indonesian media. And then another thing is that China has invited Indonesian journalists for trips to China and supply them with its own version of information. So and not only journalists, but also religious leaders. They were taken to the so-called trip to Xinjiang, and then after they return back to Indonesia, they're asked to write about China, of course, positively, and many of them do. They write about how Xinjiang issue does not exist, Islam in China is very peaceful, and so on and so forth. And then Indonesian Journalists Association has also signed agreement with All China Journalists Association, and they also created a prize for journalists who write positively about the BRI. So this is a very important aspect as well. And then another important aspect is that censoring. So China has gradually carried out effort to censor anti-China information in Indonesia. So in August 2020, for example, a Chinese tech company then censored article critical of the Chinese government in one of our news application. It's called Baca Berita, one of the biggest news aggregator application read by millions. So content related to Mao Zedong, to the Belt and Road Initiative, to the Xinjiang were selectively posted, and some of them were selectively censored. And then one of Indonesian newspaper, one of our Indonesian newspaper, the Jawa Post, were also banned in China due to its critical coverage of China. So I think these are basically the most important avenue in which Chinese media influence has grown in Indonesia.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's interesting. Yes, the prize is kind of an interesting incentive. And I think what Mohammed was saying about, a news aggregator app that is owned by ByteDance, and I think that was one of the examples we saw where in some cases, and this was fairly rare, but where you see that apps or other infrastructure that is used for sharing content that's controlled by China-based companies that have close ties to the CCP, finding evidence of manipulation. And I think the other big one is with WeChat, which is widely used in the Chinese diaspora, that you see lots of evidence of censorship or self-censorship because accounts don't want to be shut. But that's kind of when we talk about some of the infrastructural dynamics in the methodology. Those were some of the things we were looking at. So Benjamin, why don't we turn to you in terms of Malaysia, which is also, it's so interesting, even just within this one region, these three countries are so different in terms of the dynamics. And I think in Malaysia, especially with the Chinese language community being so prominent, that ends up becoming a really important factor. So over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Sarah. And again, thank you for having me here today. Yeah, I think a lot of from sort of like what Camille and Zul has sort of like shared today is that we are seeing a lot of the same sort of like efforts being done in Malaysia as well, but there are some slight differences of what we're experiencing in Malaysia, in particular because Malaysia, probably something that is unique, not just in Southeast Asia, but the rest of the world essentially, has the largest minority diaspora, or sorry, minority overseas Chinese population in the world, essentially, by percentage, essentially, it's about 25% of the entire population, which means that the entire community actually has significant political power and also political agency in a certain sense. They actually have significant political clout, and they actually also allows the Chinese community in Malaysia to be rather insular in that sense. They can integrate with the national sort of like with the national identity of sorts, but they can also operate in a very insular fashion if they need to, and many of them actually do in that sense. And as a result of that, the approaches that are employed by Beijing in Malaysia are very, very different. Rather than sort of like engaging with using sort of like very, very direct methods of trying to influence information in the Malaysian media space, they often use a lot more indirect approaches as well. So one of the ways that they do is that they approach is that rather than use state media apparatus, for instance, we do have Xinhua agency does have a sort of like a bureau, as well as Phoenix TV. They do have bureaus set up in Malaysia, but they actually are not catered towards Malaysian audiences. I think essentially Xinhua agency, the bureau's purpose is to either serve Chinese expats who are based in Malaysia, or for sort of like Chinese nationals back in China who want to know more about updates happening in Malaysia. Essentially, they do not serve Malaysians. And the simple reason is that one of the main ways in which the Chinese state sort of influences Malaysia is indirectly using local Chinese media. So the vast majority of local Chinese media in Malaysia is owned under the MCIL Corporation, the Malaysian Chinese International Limited Corporation, and it is seen as the largest international sort of like Chinese language media company. It's technically based out of Hong Kong, but its owner actually is a Malaysian, essentially. He's timber magnate Tiong Hiew King, basically. And the idea here is that Tiong Hiew King has very, very strong ties with the Chinese government, essentially. And as a result of that, a lot of his media post a lot of very pro-Beijing narratives in a lot of their reporting, essentially. So the Chinese state doesn't necessarily have to do anything on their part. They do it through these indirect means. And part of that is also because in Malaysia, due to the fact that our country, unlike most of Southeast Asia, essentially, has had a very sort of like rigid history with regards to media freedoms. You know, I think only in the last 4 years ago did we actually sort of like have a change in government from a long-standing authoritarian government for the last 50 over years. And as a result of that, that was only at the point where media freedoms became a lot more free. And for the most part, Malaysians have a very tenuous relationship with any sort of like state media messaging, essentially. And that doesn't just include Malaysian government's media messaging, but also from other governments. And as a result of that, any sort of like foreign media, especially from like state-linked media affiliates, they will always be viewed with a lot of skepticism. And so that approach to messaging towards Malaysians was never going to really be very, very effective. And so this was the approach that was generally employed as well. But that is sort of, and so a lot of the efforts that are taking place in Malaysia are actually done sort of like in informal ways and not in formal settings, essentially, you know. So as we'll probably go into it a little bit later, one of the ways, and I think just to sort of like tack on to what Camille mentioned earlier, Camille mentioned that, you know, in the Philippines especially, you know, there's a lot of these sort of like online or inauthentic behavior, coordinated inauthentic behavior attacks that are happening in the Philippines, and we're seeing a lot of that here in Malaysia as well. And while a lot of like foreign media are attributing the return of the Marcos regime to these same attacks, we are seeing a lot of these intensified here in Malaysia as well. And a lot of these are also somehow linked to China in that sense. You know, in other research that I've done, essentially, you know, we actually see that China actually has specific troll farms that are actually hosted in Malaysia, essentially, that actually coordinate these attacks. I think they target the attacks basically for Taiwan and Hong Kong. So again, you can sort of see the position that Malaysia has in regards to the way that it serves almost as an enforcer of sorts for sort of like Chinese information. On the one hand, using MCIL affiliated Chinese media, which again doesn't just service Malaysia, but they also service other regions outside internationally as well also focusing on these inauthentic troll farms, essentially, that are operating. All right, so that's it for now. I probably have a few more things to add, but we'll talk more about that later on. So back to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Benjamin. VC, I want to give you an opportunity to see if there's anything else that you wanted to add, because you had worked on all three of these reports actually, and if there's anything else that comes to mind on kind of the influence tactics that we're seeing in these three countries.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe briefly comment on the question that you posed in the beginning, where you were talking about, you know, what is actually more concerning, because, you know, public diplomacy is a common tactic that all countries around the world do. And so I think just bringing back the conversation to the more covert elements, and I think this covert stuff is a bit harder to track, and I think that's something that we could probably focus in terms of research in the future. Like of self-censorship, we saw that in many of the countries that we covered under this study, and then in Southeast Asia, I think the self-censorship came not as much with journalists specifically, but with probably editors, because if we look at, you know, state media that have content sharing agreements with Chinese state media, like Antara in Indonesia, the state-controlled Philippines news agency. If you do a closer examination into these, you might see less critical coverage of issues to do with China. So they have both the pro-Beijing coverage, and then they also have less, you know, critical coverage on issues like Xinjiang and Taiwan, South China Sea. In Malaysia, I think Benjamin might have alluded to this, we saw some self-censorship with Chinese language journalists and Chinese language media more broadly. And I think Camille was talking about the issues with financing in the media. I think around the world, there are, you know, cuts in media, especially print media, and often there's lacking of funding and capacity for good investigative journalism. So it's really important to have that to, you know, kind of uncover the more covert influence efforts. And something else Camille mentioned with social media influencers, I think that's something we should also look further into, because often they would have a very high following, especially because they post a lot of apolitical content. So content about culture, travel, and occasionally they would sprinkle in some political content. So I think in Indonesia, we saw one of the influencers, I think, visit Xinjiang and then talk about, how Islam is flourishing there. But a lot of her content is about travel, and so you can't really pick out these nuances. And I think finally, this came up in a few of our countries. I think it came up in the Philippines with trolls, pro-Beijing trolls, agents of the Chinese embassy. I think we saw that in Sri Lanka, pursuing people who might speak out against the Chinese embassy or pro-Beijing narratives. So that's also something. Sometimes this pressure is exerted, via private WhatsApp messages instead of publicly. So Benjamin was talking about how, because it's not usually the best idea to be super public about intimidation from the Chinese government's perspective, they may reach out to people through more private channels. And so, yeah, that's something we should definitely pay attention to as well.
Thanks, Bo-Chen. And yeah, that is actually something when we look at the full constellation of 30 countries, where we found that in 24, there was some form of intimidation or censorship effort that had occurred. In some cases, it was coming from the Chinese embassy and picking up the phone to an editor or journalist regarding particular coverage. In 17 countries, it actually was going through the local government or media owners and using their interests that they would themselves preemptively suppress certain coverage. And so that's some of what I think Bo-Chen and Benjamin have been alluding to. In Malaysia, there was one incident where actually the Home Ministry denied a printing license to a Chinese language outlet that was critical of the Chinese government. And we actually got a copy of the email, and it said specifically there were, because this could have harmed bilateral relations. It was a Malaysian government and agency essentially limiting access to audiences because they didn't want to upset bilateral relations. And then, as was mentioned, I think cyber attacks, blocked websites, pressure on foreign correspondents. Those are things we saw globally, but that also did appear in one way or another in the Asian context, and then even in these 3 countries. So that's kind of the influence side. So now I'm going to moving to the response side, because I think this was one of the really interesting and inspiring, and I think nuanced dimensions of this project, where what we did in each country is we looked at the media sector, the legal sector, the political sector, and the civil society sector to identify different aspects of both particular responses related to China, but also underlying dimensions and certain types of laws related to media regulation and resilience that contributed to blunting the effects of Beijing's influence efforts. So why don't I turn to you, Benjamin? I think Malaysia was actually one of the countries that ended up on the more vulnerable end of the spectrum in terms of the response to resilience. Maybe you can speak to both some of what's happening, but also maybe some of what's not happening in Malaysia from that perspective.
All right, thank you very much. So the vulnerability in Malaysia essentially is that we actually have a very, very weak media space essentially. I alluded to something about, alluded to the fact that our traditional media is heavily regulated by the government. And for the most part, practically all traditional media in the country is either heavily regulated by the government, or there are strong political ownership levels in each and every one of them essentially. So a lot of them will very rarely be critical of government, and they tend to toe whatever line the government has as well. The independent media, which tends to be mostly online media, they do they themselves also, there are some political ownerships, sort of like issues that are present there. So for the most part, they are a lot more free and open as well. But when it comes to sort of like addressing issues of sort of like dealings with China, there is a very, very strong sense of apprehension across all media in Malaysia, and just to sort of double back a bit, I think also worth mentioning also is that, the Chinese media in Malaysia tend to also operate in a space that is almost almost seen as a secondary media space, essentially. For the most part, we've got three main, technically we have four main languages in which sort of like the media publish content, but for the most part, we've got English, Malay, and of course, sort of like Chinese as well. And in that sense, the Chinese media space operates on its own sort of like bearings, essentially, and they tend to toe the line for pro-China narratives. But when it comes to sort of like the English and Malay media, they also are very, very reluctant to be critical of China. I think in recent times, the only time we ever see local media ever be critical of China, or generally is through the use, is basically for amongst the Malay language media when it comes to issues of Xinjiang, essentially. There are a couple of local media outlets, one in particular, which is Sina Harian, and they are the only ones that are openly critical of China's handling of Xinjiang. And again, this was in spite of the fact that they actually were invited to Xinjiang at one point. And even though they did publish an article from the person who was invited, that was, I wouldn't say that it was supportive of the efforts in Xinjiang, but they were presenting in a very somewhat neutral manner, but they continued their attacks against Chinese state after that as well. And so that was sort of like one example of this sort of like moving away from just sort of like supporting pro-China. And when I was speaking to journalists, essentially, many of them essentially said that a lot of local media are very reluctant to be openly critical about China on many, many different issues, especially the South China Sea issue, in particular because many of our local journalists have this understanding that, the Chinese state is generally quite sensitive towards criticism, essentially. And, we've seen a lot of examples about how either Chinese state entities or Chinese affiliated companies will actually like either pull back support or they pull back funding for any sort of like organization that sort of has links that are critical towards China, essentially. So as one person noted to me, no media in Malaysia wants to be responsible for breaking down ties between Malaysia and China, essentially, which is a huge burden that somehow the media seem to have undertaken in Malaysia. So that's one of the main issues that we have in that sense. And so I also wanted to just sort of like add that, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit there. But yes, so in general, we do have a lot of issues with regards to how the media tend to operate here as well. But I think I'll save whatever I have to say later. So over back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. And feel free to raise your hand if it comes back to you. Camille, let me turn back to you because I mean the Philippines is kind of an interesting comparison because on the one hand it faces a higher level of influence efforts, but it did actually demonstrate quite a high level of pushback and resilience and was among the countries that we found the rating in the end ended up as resilient. So maybe you can speak to a little bit of, I think there's also, there's definitely this backfiring dynamic that you see in terms
Right.
of the Chinese government actors.
Yeah, I think the Philippines has been pretty resilient to Beijing media influence. I think it all stems from the fact, or like what was mentioned earlier, the Philippine history, we've been the traditional ally of the US. And for the longest time, we've been accustomed to viewing the US as our ally and not really China or anyone else. And for that matter, another thing that's very emotional for Filipinos is the issue of the South China Sea, especially with what's happening to the Filipino fishermen and the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. So Filipinos, like ordinary Filipinos, when you talk to them and mention China and the Philippines, that's the first thing that they will mention, or that's the first thing that would come to their mind. Not so much all these diplomatic ties and all. It's really that issue with the fishermen. And with that, there's really that strong pushback. For example, at the height of the pandemic, this was before the vaccine started coming in, the Chinese state media, of course, they have long been partners with the Philippine state media. They kind of co-produced a video which shows the supposed friendship between Manila and Beijing. So the title of that video was called One Sea, or like a shared sea, alluding to, our shared resource in the South China Sea. Of course, Filipinos, coming from the 2016 ruling at The Hague, Netherlands, that basically invalidated the expansive claims of China in that area, really got mad and called out the state media and called out the producer, called out like they kept bashing the video and the artists that participated in that music video online. And so what happened was, after a few weeks, it was taken down because of public backlash. And you would see that it's not just the first time it happened, although this is the next one I'm going to say is kind of in the extreme side. So there was a partnership supposedly between ABS-CBN, the largest Philippine broadcaster, which was unfortunately shut down by President Duterte, and another Chinese Filipino network. But then Filipinos kind of thought it was being a tool of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Chinese embassy, the Chinese state. So they bashed the officers, the executives of that media company. In the end, this media partnership didn't push through, and the news program already aired for 3 days. So you'd see that the executives of the media company listened to the public. And also on top of that, the Philippines has one of the freest press in Asia for the longest time, although we suffered a lot under President Duterte. But still, we have that culture of watchdog journalism, independent reporting. So it's kind of like that. So I think even if you would see, like in the Philippines, there are news outlets that parrot Chinese narratives or have content sharing agreement with China, you would also see that these same companies also publish stories critical of China, which are mainly sourced from the wires like Reuters, AFP, Associated Press, and all that. And another thing is civil society is a big thing in the Philippines. It's very vibrant here, especially on press freedom. And the National Union of Journalists in the Philippines recently published reporting guidelines on how to report about China affairs. So these are the things that have become very useful for the Philippines. Although now it's very useful, but until when, we have to see.
Thank you, Camille. And yeah, those journalist guidelines really stood out among the collection of countries we had, because it was about, that they took this effort, but it had elements that reflected on different aspects of best practices related to not editorial independence and that being very important, but also even elements like not using racist language, for example, which is something that came up, and is a kind of a tricky balance that I think a lot of democracies are facing, where on the one hand, there are legitimate concerns related to influence from the Chinese government. On the other hand, there's a local Chinese community, and being very careful, and we're very careful as well about how we frame that. And so that was actually very impressive, I think, in terms of looking at like what those guidelines are. And I think as we're moving forward on this project, it's one of those examples that we're hoping to also share with journalist unions in other countries around the world, as kind of an example of something to consider, to proactively think about how journalists and how media are covering China. So Mohammed, let me turn to you, because Indonesia kind of falls somewhere in the middle between this. But there's some really interesting, I think, pushback and limits on how much the Chinese government has been able to frame conversations in Indonesia. So why don't you go ahead and explain some of that?
Right. I think when it comes to Indonesia, there are two types of resilience. The first one is the general resilience, and the second one is the China-specific resilience. When it comes to general one, I think the most important one is that in Indonesia, we have a strong protection against foreign ownership of media companies. So foreigners are not allowed to own media company in Indonesia. So this helped us to have a stronger silence when it comes to Chinese media influence. And then there is a growing phenomena of investigative journalists, where now there is a growing number of investigative journalism. Although it wasn't really a culture before, in Indonesia, but now there is a growing investigative journalism in Indonesia. And then in addition to that, our press council has very strong guidelines on journalism ethics and has established itself as the most capable in settling media-related dispute out of court. So this also helps us to have a good resilience when it comes to foreign media influence. However, when it comes to the China-specific media resilience, I think the most important one is that media in Indonesia, despite the fact that they have a relationship, despite the fact that some academic studies have proven that many of the media who have signed partnership with China tend to avoid negative stories about China, but they are still critical of China in some sense, especially when it comes to the Xinjiang coverage and the South China Sea issue. So they are still critical in those areas, despite the fact that they're often posting news on that are positive about China. And then there is also a public pushback against state media narratives. So, you know, for one example is that in the early days of the pandemic, Xinhua published an article claiming that batik, that one of our traditional fabric, was originated from China. And there was a huge backlash in the social media then. And then when it comes to the Xinjiang issue, there is a account like Indonesia Stand with Uyghur and Twitter hashtag on how Indonesia is standing with Uyghur and so on and so forth. This also helps balancing information that comes from Chinese media expansion in Indonesia. And then another thing is that there is a strong political pushback when it comes to our core national interests. So even pro-China Indonesian politicians do not hesitate to criticize China when it comes to Indonesia's core national interests, like the issue of the South China Sea. So many of the politicians keep criticizing China on this issue. So I think this resilience, both the China-specific resilience and the general resilience, such as prohibition of foreign ownership of a media company, help the somehow strengthen the resilience against Chinese media influence in Indonesia.
Thanks, Muhammad. And Muhammad's too modest to note this, but he's actually also played a role, I think, in really, you know, helping talk about in the public debate and awareness in Indonesia about how this media influence works. And I think there's definitely more attention to it, you know, thanks to some of his own writings. BC, is there anything else that you'd like to add from any of these examples in terms of, you know, kind of what are some of the sources of resilience or incidents of response?
Yeah, I can speak to a couple more examples. So I think in addition to Mohammed's good reporting and analysis, there was an Indonesian think tank that did a report on how China was trying to shape perspectives towards Xinjiang and why the response in Indonesia has been the way it is. And we're seeing growing efforts in the region, but there's still some vulnerability there because there are gaps in how the people who study China understand how CCP influence work, how specific departments within China, like the United Front Work Department, how they're trying to shape narratives around the world. But there's, I think, in the region, a growing body of young scholars looking into China and CCP influence. In Malaysia, actually, interestingly, Malaysia Kini, which is an independent online outlet, actually did an investigation into a case of misinformation regarding the Hong Kong protest. So there was some, disinformation regarding the protests floating around on the internet. And it was discovered by Malaysia Kini that a lot of the Chinese language media picked up this disinformation and then spread it to their followers on Facebook and elsewhere. So, and that was uncovered because of, really good work from the journalists there. And I think Camille, when she was a journalist at Rappler, got some funding to do an investigation into Chinese influence from an international organization, kind of underlying the point that, with diverse funding, with more sources of funding that we can create a more diverse media environment. Another interesting example in Indonesia in the Chinese language space was that one of the papers, Chinese diaspora papers based there, was able to share resources with a Malaysia paper, a Malaysia Chinese language paper, and that allowed them to do a bit more independent reporting compared to the other Chinese diaspora papers in Indonesia. So that was, another example of diverse funding. And I think finally, one of our key findings was that many of the outlets that had content sharing agreements with Chinese state media would also publish some critical coverage. It depends on the outlet, but oftentimes, as Camille mentioned, they would republish critical information regarding China's human rights abuses from international newswires like Reuters, and sometimes there's original reporting too. So it's, diverse media environments are really important, and they probably do contribute to the healthy levels of skepticism we see in Southeast Asia towards China.
Thanks. Yeah, and a number of these points came up across other countries. I think this element of investigations and reportings related to CCP influence and how it manifests locally. We actually found examples of that in 28 out of the 30 countries we looked at. And a lot of cases, it really had a kind of an outsized impact at increasing public awareness and policy awareness, and especially when it was uncovering some form of corrupt or covert behavior that was clearly, inappropriate. I think that really, helped people get a sense that this is actually something to keep an eye out for. And then on the media regulations, we also found in a lot of countries limits on foreign ownership and other provisions that require enhanced transparency. So at least who's owning the media, and then also related to, say, Freedom of Information Act requests, and that those were used often by journalists to expose, problematic influence or money, trace the money trail from Chinese state entities to, say, local media or local social media influencers. So those, I think, in terms of, as we're thinking about in democracies, what are some of the elements that can help, I think, underpin press freedom and transparency generally, but then also when it comes to, blunting the impact of more problematic forms of infiltration from the Chinese Communist Party, that those can be very effective. I'd actually like to turn to, I have one more question for our panelists, but I'm going to leave it for the end. Because it's a little bit more forward-looking, and actually turn it to invite our kind of our Korean discussants to join, and I think whoever is managing the screen can maybe add a few more faces. So we have Professor Bokmo Jung from Pokyang National University, who's himself who's a specialist on the Philippines. We have Professor Inwan Hwang from Gyeongsang National University, who focuses on Malaysia, and Professor Hyungjun Kim from Kangwon National University, who looks at Indonesia. And I hope I got the names the names are pretty close. So why don't we start with Professor Bumojong on the Philippines? I mean, feel free to respond to what Camille and others shared, but also I think just speak to, you know, what you've observed and in terms of your own work and focus on the Philippines.
Thank you so much. Okay, and then the first of all, I'm very honored to be here for having a wonderful discussion on this topic. And then, yeah, through the report by the Freedom House, I have noticed many, like the various significant change after the influence of the Chinese government. And rather than like, since I don't have any expertise to interpret those like a change, just like let me share my question with the Camelia or other participant here. Anyway, the most important issues, as Professor Kim Dong-yeop said in the beginning, what are the current position of the Philippines after the government change. So even because the report is until 2021, it does not mention after the government change. So we are very curious that after the Duterte and then after the change, what is the position of the current government about this one, especially like about the South China Sea issues, as she mentioned, after international tribunal, so the Philippine government can claim those areas, but during the Duterte government, they did not. So that's the first question for me. And the second one is anyway, the public opinion. Well, that really changed after this kind of influence. So as she said, unlike the other countries in Southeast Asia, the Filipino, usually they have some they have enough knowledge to criticize certain the pressure by some Chinese government or media, and then also the media environment of the Philippines is relatively free. So especially regarding the issue of the South China Sea or the military advance of the Chinese troops, is there any change of the mass people? And then just let me add one thing more, about some Chinese immigrants. Unlike other countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippine, the Chinese ethnic community is not so like the enclaved or exclusive, right? So, and then they don't have any like exclusive education institute and then they learn the Chinese language. It's a little bit different situation. So in your report, like the Manila Times, they started to have some Chinese version of that one, but normally the ethnic Chinese, they can be proud of being Chinese, but it does not mean like they have the favor toward the Chinese government. So that could be the totally different that one. So even though they can be proud of Chinese, but their political position toward the Chinese current government could be the difference. So I want to hear what is some those ideas. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your questions. For the first question, like about the South China Sea and what the government plans to do about it, or like the next steps of action. Honestly, right now with President Marcos only in power for a few months, we are still in the wait and see period. because right now President Marcos just came back from the United States, from New York, to attend the United Nations General Assembly, and there he mentioned something like it's a total contrast. So what happens now is that what we're seeing is President Marcos is trying to kind of be friends again with the United States, and at the same time be still friends with China, as compared to what President Duterte did to totally, lambast Obama, totally lambast the United States, and just be friends with Putin and Xi Jinping. So that's what President Marcos is doing now. But in terms of the South China Sea, he is torn because he knows the sentiment of the Filipino people. The Filipino people, it's really like what I said, it's really an emotional issue for us, for the ordinary public. But at the same time, we know the history of President Marcos and China, because the diplomatic ties between Beijing and Manila started under the term of Mao Zedong and and Bongbong's father, the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So there's that personal ties, and the Marcos family is big with personal ties. In fact, even before he won the presidency, he was always spotted joining embassy events, joining all these press release events of the Chinese embassy and all that. And quite interestingly, it's not just Bongbong Marcos who we have to watch out for. It's also our Vice President, Sara Duterte. She's the daughter of the former president, and just recently, I think this is quite interesting. So it's the 73rd National Assembly or National Founding Day of China, I think. And this week, Sara Duterte actually posted a website, and I posted a video, and then the Chinese embassy reposted that video of Sara Duterte speaking flawed Mandarin, greeting China for the 73rd anniversary, and Filipinos were really livid with what she's doing. Two parts. The Filipino Chinese are mad because she's butchering the language, and at the same time, the ordinary Filipino people are like mad at, what are you gonna sell? Like, you're really a pet of China, or you're going to sell the South China Sea to the Chinese government. So those are the impact. And I think for the South China Sea right now, Bongbong Marcos will try to not raise publicly, to not shame Xi Jinping publicly, because he knows very well that's not what China wants. But then at the same time, he's pushed into a corner because his constituents, the Filipino people, want some action or want some, verbal assurance that he will not let any of these, a single inch of territory be given away. I hope that answers that. And then for the public opinion, the influence, owing to the history of the Philippines, have been really, I think the way I remember I told Sarah and BC about this, I think we've been colonized effectively. That's why, Filipinos until now view America as the better partner as compared to China or anyone else. So that's where it's coming from. And actually, even if President Duterte, even if he became the #1 cheerleader of China in public during his 6-year term, he wasn't able to bring Filipinos with him because of that history of that cultural history that we have. And it's really owing to the South China Sea. Filipinos really don't trust China, as exhibited in different polling surveys. And what's your third question about the Chinese immigrants? Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I understood it right, what your question was, but I think for the Chinese Filipinos, especially for the 3rd, 4th generation, they're kind of already distant from the original, China and all. But the history of Chinese immigrants in the Philippines is that they're mostly pro Taiwan than China. That's their origin, because before, that's why Chinese immigrants in the Philippines, even in schools, they would mostly teach traditional Chinese language and not simplified. So that's the history based on the interviews I made with several several young immigrants. But at the same time, these are, as with any other country, these Chinese immigrants hold strong economic influence, strong economic power. So they're still very, like a lot of them, we're seeing that they still want closer ties with Beijing because of their business ties and all that. So there's a generational divide, I think. Like the younger kind of feel they're more Filipinos, but the older, they feel like they're more Chinese. That's all.
Thank you, Camille. And on the public opinion, I mean, in the overall group of countries we looked at, actually in 23 out of the 30, public opinion about China or the Chinese government got worse since 2018. So even as the Chinese government's investing more, it's not winning the battle for public opinion. But I think that's one reason why we also start to see these trickier tactics happening. And like in the US, for example, we saw that more efforts that relate to disinformation and fake accounts, more bullying and things like that of journalists, payment having, paying a scholar to write a pro Huawei article, but then not revealing that the person was paid by Huawei to write it. So I think there is maybe some correlation between kind of the failure to influence public opinion, or actually the Chinese government's own actions undermining some of what it's trying, the narratives it's pushing, and then the emergence of some of these sneakier type of more sophisticated tactics. So Professor Inwang Huang, why don't you work on the Philippines? I don't know if you have any comments or any questions for Benjamin. I'm sorry, but we'll work on Malaysia in terms of any comments or questions for Benjamin regarding the situation in Malaysia. Oh, you seem to be muted still. No, I don't think we can hear you. Why don't you try now? Nope. All right, so why don't we do Indonesia first, and we'll let you try to see if you can figure that out, maybe some headphones.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep,
So please
great.
go ahead.
Good morning, and I'm very glad to be here to listen to stories, which is not that familiar to me. I'm an anthropologist working on Indonesian Islam, so that like Pemojang, I cannot add some new fresh informations on the issue, but I just raise some questions specifically to Zulfikar. I think it is useful for us to divide long-term and short-term strategies of China on the issue of media influence. So in this sense, for short terms, China, I think, has to defend issues, more critical issues like Xinjiang and South China Sea. But at the same time, I'm thinking that in the long term, they have strategies to change perception, negative perception of Indonesians to China matters. As BC Han said before, some soft issues might be very important, such as travel or food or films or something like music or something like that. So when it comes to Korea in Indonesia, recently, I don't know why, but there are heaps of news and SNS informations on Korea, especially on travel to Korea or films and in some sense, foods of Korea. So I'd like to ask whether China has a specific strategy to change their perception of Indonesians, especially in the fields of in the softer fields of culture. I have an impression that information on Chinese culture and Chinese lifestyle has changed recently. So are there any systematic attempts, or it is just the interest of Indonesians, whether information of China has increasing recently? That's the first question. And my second question might be a bit difficult for you to answer because it is related to Chinese Indonesians. So I have seen some newspapers which is written in Chinese character in Indonesia. So I cannot read Chinese, so I don't know what is what is carried in these newspapers. But as Benjamin has said, the Chinese newspapers written in Chinese character have a high probability that it carries a very favorable opinions on China, or they just bring some materials from Chinese press. So in this sense, I'm wondering whether you know that what contents are carried in these newspapers written in Chinese character in Indonesia. That's my second question. And my third question is related to Indonesian Islamic organization. I've read some of your report, and it says that some leaders of the largest Indonesian Islamic organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, have revealed a very favorable position toward China. They visited Xinjiang, and they said that the Muslim minority in China are treated very well, and they have good position in China, something like that. So I'm wondering why ANU, the organization, whether, of course, it is only some of the leaders have favorable attitude toward Xinjiang issues propagandized by Chinese governments. So I think this issue is very important for us to understand the resilience or vulnerability of Indonesian toward Chinese penetration. So in the sense, I think, and because I have been working on Indonesian Islam, I was a bit surprised because they knew that Xinjiang issue is quite critical in Indonesia, and they knew that some of the radical groups in Indonesia shows very militant attitude toward the Xinjiang issues.
소리가 들려요? 지금?
Yeah. In spite of these, I'm wondering why some of ANU leaders shows favorable attitude towards Xinjiang issues in China. Yes, so that's all for the moment.
Go ahead, Muhammad. Those are all very, very thoughtful and interesting questions. I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts.
All right, thank you, Professor Kim, and thank you, Sarah. So when it comes to Chinese strategy, of course, this media influence is not the only Chinese soft power strategy in Indonesia. China has exerted a lot of efforts through education, for example, through the establishment of Confucius Institutes, and also culture, right? Since the Belt and Road Initiative was initiated in 2012, there is an increasing number of cultural events in Indonesia, including cultural exchanges among students, among individuals, and so on and so forth. However, and including popular media, one of the example that we mentioned in our report is Hai Indo Channel. This is a popular media Chinese channel in Indonesia. However, I see that when it comes to the popular media, China definitely lost it when it comes to the Korean waves. I think Indonesians love the K-pop more than the all those Chinese drama. Back then, there were some Chinese drama broadcasted in Indonesia, but now the Korean wave, I think, winning all the way through. So when it comes to popular media, I think China lost in this. But I think I will mention this later when it comes to the future outlook, but I will mention briefly here that I think China will use other platforms. One of the examples is the social media. Recently, I wrote a piece on China's growing use of Twitter or diplomacy. Twitter diplomacy using the Twitter, which I think becoming very apparent with the recent appointment of the new Chinese ambassador to Indonesia, because previously Chinese ambassador did not have Twitter account, but the new ambassador Lu Kang, has made as soon as he was appointed by President Joko Widodo, he made his Twitter account, and now I think he has around 8,000 Twitter accounts. And one of his activities was countering, responding to American embassy statement on the South China Sea. So that's, I think, one of the examples. And then another avenue through which China is trying to change Indonesian public opinion is through think tank diplomacy. So China has increasingly funded a number of think tanks in Indonesia. The coordinator for this is the ASEAN Study Center at Gajah Mada University. It is the major coordinator for Chinese think tank diplomacy. So not only China provide funding, but also training to researchers and so on and so forth. So I think this is a new avenue for China in trying to change the public opinion in Indonesia. And then when it comes to Chinese newspapers, Indonesia's Chinese newspaper is small and shrinking because, as I think you know, that in 1965, President Suharto decided to ban any publication on Chinese, and therefore the number of it has been shrinking, and many of these papers, despite the fact that there are some Chinese language newspapers in Indonesia, but many of them try to avoid pro-Beijing narratives. I think the main reason is because they are afraid of any backlash, of a local backlash against favoring China's interests over Indonesia. So they try to be neutral as much as possible in this regard. So I think when it comes to the Chinese language media, they do exist, but their influence is not very big. And then your last question about Islamic or the Muslim organization, it is true that the impact is increasingly apparent. So many religious leaders are now voicing positive news about China, not only from Nahdlatul Ulama, but also from Muhammadiyah. There is one peer-reviewed journal on Muhammadiyah leaders that after their visit to Xinjiang, many of the Muhammadiyah religious leaders tend to avoid narratives that are negative about China on their social media. So it is proven scientifically that there is a change of narrative among religious leaders in Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. And I think one of the reasons why they do so is because, especially for Nahdlatul Ulama, they have a strong relationship with the government. And as you know that now the current government has a very close relationship with Indonesia. And then the second reason is because they, especially Nahdlatul Ulama, they want to become the main defender of Indonesia's counter-terrorism effort. And they see that the issue of Xinjiang is somehow related. I think, following Chinese narrative, the Chinese policy in Xinjiang is a counter-terrorism effort. So they see this as a way of being the defender of Indonesia's counter-terrorism effort. So this is one of the reasons, I think one of the major reasons why this organization tend to have positive or tend to avoid a negative perception on China's policy towards Xinjiang. I hope it answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's very interesting. I think in terms of, what are some of the elements even in terms of the Chinese government's narratives that sometimes tend to stick with local populations or constituencies, particularly that anti-terrorism dimension. In some of the work I was doing, like in Israel, there was attempts to try that as well in terms of justifying some of the, the repression there. So I'm glad to see or hear Inwan Huang. So why don't I turn it over to you for any questions or comments regarding to Malaysia?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can.
Quite impressed that there's some problems on my audios. First of all, I would like to thank Freedom House and the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies for giving me this chance. And in general, I fully agree what Freedom House research find, especially it is quite interesting for me because this research covers the period of 2019 to the 2021. As you know that as a Malaysian specialist, I don't have any chance to visit Malaysia for this period. In order to assess Chinese media influence over Malaysia, I think it will be necessary to consider changes in Malaysia's political and media landscape a little bit the back for last 2 decades. I think there are two important turning points to understand Malaysian politics over past 20 years. The first is the political crisis leading to the reforms in 1998. The second is the regime change between the ruling and opposition parties in May 2018. Malaysia's media landscape in its relations with the government is also closely related to the mentioned this major two turning points. I believe that from independence to present day, the influence of Malaysia's mainstream media has always been powerful, so that cannot be ignored. However, it's also worth noting that Malaysia's media landscape has been dramatically changed since the reformasi. I still remember that the readers of Malaysia Kini once outnumbered the readers of the Star and NST during that period of time. So along with these changes in the media landscape, it also, that we have to remember that revitalization of political and civil society during this period. In discussing I'd like to raise a couple of questions, and if possible, I'd like to hear some additional explanations. When we discuss about China's media's influence over Malaysia, I think we need to consider two important factors, that is ethnic and generation variable. First, I'm quite curious whether the Freedom House research can find any meaningful difference in China's media influence over Malaysia by ethnic the groups. It can be assumed that the Malays and the Indians are so to be relatively less exposed to China's media influence. Have there been any research result showing that the nexus between the ethnic factors and China's media influence? That is my first questions. And second, even in the case of Chinese community, I think the older generation and the younger generation should be viewed separately, especially in case of younger generation of Chinese communities. Apart from their ethnic identity, I understand the Malaysian national the identity has been getting stronger for the last few decades. So I wonder whether these younger generations, the attitude toward the expansion of China's media influence can be different from the older generation. So I don't know whether this the Freedom House report cover this area or not. If not, I think Benjamin, you can explain a bit of these points as I think you're representing the younger generation of the Malaysian people. That is my comment and questions.
All right, thank you very much for that. Okay, so just two very straightforward questions, simple questions, but actually can take quite a bit of time to sort of explain that as well. So I'll try to do my best. Right off the bat, I would say that no, the Freedom House report does not actually address this because again, I think I think as you're probably aware, essentially, you know, the ethnic division within Malaysia is quite complex and complicated. And I think sort of like going into that for the report would have significantly sort of like would be in a significant tangent in the reporting essentially. So I'll try to sort of explain as much as I can here to sort of like try to get everybody up to speed basically. Okay, so for your first question basically is that what are the effects of ethnic and generational variables in China's media influence? I would definitely say there's a very, very strong component of that essentially. With regards to ethnic, I think as you mentioned basically, yes, Malay and Indian sort of like communities are not exposed, but that again is only under certain situations, you know, under the Xinjiang issue is the one that's the most salient towards the Malay community. And they, of course, were very critical and very unreceptive towards, you know, the sort of like the narratives that came out of Beijing essentially. So that one, we've got it documented quite a bit. And I think just wanted to add on to that point that I wasn't to make earlier was that I think what was highlighted, I think by BC was that a lot of the local media in many Southeast Asian countries, if they wanted to be critical of China, they would often just sort of like use news wires and whatnot to sort of publish information. That this was a way to insulate them from any sort of from being perceived as being critical of China essentially. But what we saw a lot of the same thing in Malaysia, but what was very interesting with some local Malay dailies was that they would use these news wires, but they would heavily editorialize their headlines. So the news piece essentially would basically just exactly verbatim from the news wires, but they would often include a very more scathing and often sarcastic remark in the headline essentially. So that was a way for them to sort of challenge these narratives in a very, very indirect fashion as well. But again, this was only mostly when it came towards issues of Xinjiang. Other issues that tended to sort of like extend beyond the Chinese community basically were issues related to sort of like Hong Kong, essentially, especially with the Hong Kong protests. And this was something that was, I guess, again, this was because we saw that there were a lot of these, like, as I mentioned earlier, basically, we do see a lot of troll farms that are based in Malaysia that for some local experts, we believe that they either employ local Chinese Malaysians or Chinese students who are studying in Malaysia to sort of like work at these sort of like troll farms. And for the most part, they are funded by local Malaysian political parties. And their focus basically is to sort of engage in like the Hong Kong and Taiwanese media spaces, but they also do work in the Malaysian spaces periodically as well. Sometimes, because they just follow the will of their political masters to engage. But when it came to issues really regarding the sort of like the Hong Kong protests, that's when we saw a lot of these trolls started to sort of aim their attention towards basically attacking the sort of like the Hong Kong democracy movement and really abandon whatever political affiliations they had within Malaysia, essentially. So that was a very, very interesting thing. And that sort of extended beyond the ethnic divide as well. For your next question, basically about generational variables, I think there is definitely some key differences there as well. But there are some changes, or rather, I wouldn't say that there's a difference between old and young, because there's of course a lot of nuances happen. There's a lot of different sort of like different, you could say there are different eras essentially. So yes, most older generation Chinese Malaysians tend to have a very, very strong romantic view of China essentially. So they have a natural affinity towards it, and they are the most receptive to pro-Beijing narratives, because for them, it's often seen as this is a way for them to sort of like reconnect with their past, especially in Malaysia, where our government, certain members of our government, the ethno-nationalist parts of our government tend to sort of like vilify any non-Malays in this country essentially. So for a lot of older generation, they do sort of like cling to that sort of belief in that way. But for younger generation, and when I use the term younger generation, I would basically say for people who are arguably Gen X all the way up until, so for Gen X, people who are born in like the 70s and the 60s, and all the way until people maybe who are born from my generation, basically the millennial generation, we have a much more conflicted approach to looking at China. I think for the most part, due to the fact that in Malaysia, we do have we previously had well, I wouldn't say segregated, we had a quota-based education system, which means that priority was given to the sort of like the indigenous and Malay groups in the country, basically to get first dibs, first entry into public universities. And so for a lot of the sort of like what we call the non-Malay groups, basically, so like the Chinese and Indians, they were often left out in that sense. And for many Chinese communities, their approach essentially was, again, Chinese community in this country has significant economic well-being essentially, and they very, very quickly reacted to the situation by saying that, okay, rather than focus on trying to get my kids into local public universities here to get a tertiary education, why don't we focus on sending them elsewhere? And the target destination for many of these kids who grew up in the 80s and in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was Taiwan. So many of these kids ended up doing their bachelor's degree in Taiwan. They even do their master's. And when they return, even though they do have a sort of like, they do have a more sympathetic view towards China as a whole, they were also very, very sympathetic towards the Taiwanese struggle, essentially. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of, there is a huge contention. And that's where the Chinese engagement with local Chinese Malaysians, a lot of that focus, I mean, for the most part, the Malaysian Chinese Malaysians are quite supportive of China in that sense. That's their view. But when it comes to Taiwan, that's when a lot of that contention comes in, because many of these Taiwanese graduates actually are working in these local Chinese newspapers as well. So they influence a lot of the local media regarding Taiwan. And that's one of the main contentions. So, and as a result of that, there is that from that generation, essentially, the support for China is often seen as being divided. And also, even though they're educated in Taiwan, they're exposed to more Western thought as well. And so they have a lot more neutral and balanced view of things. Now, when we go to the sort of like the post-millennial or the Gen Z generation, things get a little bit more pro-China. The skew towards China is a lot stronger there as well. For the most part, many of the sort of like kids in this generation, they are more exposed to Chinese media. Previously, before Chinese language, a lot of the Chinese language media that we received in Malaysia tended to either be Taiwanese or Hong Kong in nature. We didn't really get a lot of like mainland Chinese-based media, but that has changed quite a bit in recent times. So for a lot of them, they are more engrossed in Chinese language media, which means that they have a stronger affinity towards China. And the Chinese government has also sort of like prepared for a lot of more educational pathways into China for Chinese Malaysians, either offering scholarships or giving more opportunities for Chinese students to go there. So as I spoke to one local expert, he basically said that for China, they see that, yes, these sort of like pro-Taiwanese people in like the Malaysian media, they are a dying breed essentially, and they are basically sort of like curating the next wave of younger Malaysians who will have a more stronger pro-China slant coming out of it essentially. So in a sense, so basically we're seeing sort of like three different types of generations, basically. You've got the much older ones, which are either first or second generation Chinese, who of course have a very strong affinity towards the state of China. Then you've got the sort of like the Gen X and sort of like millennial generation, which had a more sort of like more exposed, more robust exposure. So while they may not necessarily be pro-China, they do have a more balanced view towards them in that sense. And then more recently, we're starting to see a shift towards more pro-China narratives amongst the younger generation. So I hope that answers your question. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
That's very interesting, Benjamin. And all the conversations we've had as part of this project, this hasn't actually come out before, and it's very, very interesting. And I think also how, you know, we're talking about kind of China's influence in the region, but we've already touched on Korean soft power and Taiwanese soft power as well. So that's kind of very interesting as well. You know, with some of the time we have remaining, I wanted to open it up for any other participants who'd like to ask a question to the panelists. Feel free to kind of raise your hand or type in the chat. And I'll just give a minute to see if anyone, you know, would like to chime in. I do have one last question for the panelists we can turn to as well, but I'm trying to see if anyone has any questions. And Professor Gu, please help me out here if there is anyone. Okay, I don't see.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, since there is no.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, this is Dong-Yeop Kim. I'm the one who delivered the opening address. Well, I just observed these discussions and quite interesting discussions I heard. And if thinking about the Korean cases, the media environment was quite changed drastically recent few years. I think especially because of the COVID-19 situations. And the established media institutions their power is gradually declining, and the social media influence is getting high. So I think in your researches during the COVID-19 period, and I think that China was quite successful in the vaccine diplomacy. I mean the neighboring countries, and also I think the Beijing also have a huge influence in the social media too. So these two factors, the changes of the media environment and the COVID-19 situation and vaccine diplomacy affect the public opinions among these countries. That is my question, how it affects the changes of the public opinions. As Sarah mentioned that the positive opinion toward Beijing is increasing from before 1918 to the coverage of this research. So I think those kind of changes, media environment and vaccine diplomacy may affect these trends or not. So I'd like to hear from probably BC Han may give the answer of this question. Thank you.
All right, PC, we'll give you the first dibs on this.
Sure. So if I understand correctly, the question was about how public opinion has shifted and why there is that sort of decrease from before to after. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think what role, you know, COVID vaccine diplomacy and mass diplomacy, some of those narratives have played or not in some of.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for your question, Professor Kim. So I think in a lot of the countries that we looked at, COVID-19, depending on the level of, you know, medical supply or donations that came from China and the narrative surrounding that, led to a bit of a spike in, you know, in more positive feelings towards the Chinese government. And then, but overall, it didn't have an effect on people's perceptions of, Xi Jinping or the Chinese governance model in countries where we could get, more disaggregated data on these questions. Because there's a lot of more broad-ranging questions like, oh, do you have a positive opinion on China overall? And then there's more of those disaggregated questions about what do you think about, Chinese economic influence? Do you think China is being a revisionist power in the region? And to almost all of these questions, you see sort of a decline before 2019 versus after. And then with the ones where we could get COVID data on, there might have been a small spike, but it didn't really affect, all of these other broader ranging questions. I don't know if Sarah, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just second that. I mean, I think what was really interesting is a lot was dependent on what public opinion data was available. But it is really interesting how when you get more nuanced questions, you get more nuanced answers. So you have countries that might have a pretty high favorability view of China, but that is often more the cultural dimensions, the food, the cultural affinity. And then you get into questions of, or, acknowledgement of the potential economic benefits for a particular country of better trade with China. But then you get into questions if they're asking about human rights, or they're asking about how much you trust Xi Jinping on the world stage, or they're asking about any concerns over economic investment in the local environment. And those are much more negative. So I think you do see this kind of, more nuanced distinction among many audiences of, what is the Chinese government, or what might be, I think, a greater awareness of some of the downsides of certain types of engagement with the Chinese government. And I think that's why we're also seeing a push for more safeguards. I think with COVID, there is also, I think there was a fair, pretty good level of awareness varying in different countries of what happened in Wuhan in the early days of the pandemic. And so I think, the extent to which there was a cover up, the extent to which, this allowed, whether COVID would have spread anyway, I mean, we don't know. But I think those elements actually, and the actual impact that COVID had on people's lives did more harm, I think, for the Chinese government and reputation than what they were able to recoup with vaccine diplomacy or mask diplomacy. It's a good question. It was a very particular period.
There's one person who raised the question, Cameron, probably. Please open your video so we can invite you to the panel.
Thank you very much. I don't think my video seems to be working properly right now on my computer, but I have a quick question for Zulfikar Rahmat about the penetration of Chinese media into the Indonesian media landscape. In the report, Zulfikar Rahmat assessed that the cooperation between the two media landscapes are on Metro TV, the national broadcast television, and the Jakarta Post. As we know that there are not many young Indonesians nowadays trust the national television stations due to their involvement in politics, as well as that the Jakarta Post is in decline. So in terms of influence, the Jakarta Post is not really that influential. I would like to know Mr. Zulfikar Rahmat's opinion about how the Chinese media penetration on YouTube, as if we check on YouTube, there is a new media station, which is Asumsi. And this YouTube channel has about 1.2 million followers, and it frequently releases videos on China about how China challenges the Western dominance, or how China successfully built its country to become a powerful nation. So what does Mr. Zulfikar Rahmat think about this issue, and how this kind of media channel on YouTube is not featured in the report? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cameron, for your question. So yeah, that is correct. That nowadays a lot of young people, they increasingly have some kind of skepticism over national media. And it is true that many of these media are now in decline. One of the reasons is because the penetration of social media, where people now rely more on social media rather than on traditional media. But however, we do highlight that I think this particular effort by China to penetrate national media is very important, because even though they are in decline, the effort is still there. If we talk about influence, of course, the influence of social media is more important. Now, and then when it comes to Asumsi channel, so Asumsi is a, for those who don't know, Asumsi is an Indonesian YouTube channel which has millions of followers or subscribers, and they have one section which called Qiguan. Qiguan, I think it's a name of a Chinese tea. So Qiguan was created by a PhD, not PhD, he graduated from Chinese University. So he was a student who received a scholarship. As I mentioned earlier, or as we mentioned in our report, that one of Chinese effort is providing scholarship that is specifically targeted to Muslim students, right, to study in China, and after they return back, now they voicing positive views on China. So this particular YouTube channel, not YouTube channel per se, but the section in the YouTube channel was created and was hosted and has been hosted by this Chinese student or Indonesian student who used to study in China, and now they're voicing positive narratives about China. So I think this is one exemplification of how Chinese effort in changing public opinion is somehow successful, in providing scholarship, and many of the students are now returning to Indonesia, and now they're spreading positive news about China. And I think one particular video was about how the issue is Xinjiang does not really exist, something like that. So I think in a way, this, I think, as I mentioned earlier, in the future, social media will be a very important avenue for China in influencing the opinion of Indonesian people. And I think the Asumsi channel is one of the example for this. I hope it answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Muhammad. That is a great segue into the final last quick question I have for each of you before we wrap up, which is, what should we watch for? Kind of looking ahead. I mean, I think what's been really interesting to me in hearing the conversation today is, of course, the role of social media, this intersection, and we saw this in a number of countries, between other forms of political influence from the CCP, especially related to certain parts of the elites, either the political elite or the academic elite, and how that ends up translating into the media sector and public debate. And then, I think these strategic elements related to the different generational differences, particularly when we're talking about who actually uses traditional media, who's using social media. So Camille, why don't you go first? What, if you'd say one thing to watch for, I guess in the coming year in terms of the Philippines and this dimension of kind of, well, relations with China, but more specifically kind of the media and information sector.
Yes, just two things. First is the increasing presence on social media, because I think like what we're seeing now, the early days of China using influencers in the Philippines, I'm quite interested to know and see what other tactics will they use? Like covert tactics, like especially on social media, because disinformation is very rampant in the Philippines. China, for example, they don't really need to bring in their people, do it somewhere. Everything's here already in the Philippines. Lack of legislation, political beneficiaries of disinformation. So it's all that. All they have to do is like with a click of a finger, they can do it. So we have to monitor that. And also, of course, the changing political landscape because of how our new president, Marcos, and China will interact with each other concerning the South China Sea. And I think whatever decisions they will have on that will affect also the next tactics of China in terms of trying to influence, trying to disseminate their preferred narratives. So those are the two.
Great. Yes. Thanks a lot. Benjamin, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, well, I guess in Malaysia, in the next year, well, we're supposed to be having an election. Well, it could either be next month or sometime next year, basically. But essentially, we're expecting to see a lot more intensified efforts. I mean, with regards to China's influence, probably not much. I think one thing that came about basically in the last few years was that, prior to the change in government, China's engagement with Malaysia basically was pretty much just with the government. But ever since the change in government, they expanded their efforts. And I think ever since we had the coup that took place in 2020, the Chinese government basically now has to force itself to essentially be aware of just about every political player here, because again, the political situation here is just so unstable, so shifting, and as a result of that, they are keeping tabs on everyone essentially. So again, that's sort of like how it's happening at the structural level essentially. But I think similar to Camille's concerns with the use of these online coordinated inauthentic behaviors, essentially, it's something that we in Malaysia definitely are facing the similar situation. But I think Malaysia likes to take credit for certain things. I think there are some scholars that argue that Malaysia came up with the term cyber trooper, that it was one of the first few countries that came up with the idea. I think it came up about it as early as 1999 or 2003, essentially. So and so Malaysia has sort of like this you could actually look at Malaysia as sort of like the natural progression of a country that doesn't deal with these sort of like problematic disinformation campaigns that are held by these politically motivated agents, essentially. And it's actually one of the main problems that we're facing, because there is practically no political will to actually resolve the situation, because every political entity in this country uses these sort of like politically motivated agents to support themselves in very different ways and shapes. And that notwithstanding, the bigger issue essentially is that we don't have a strong enough civil society space here that is able to counteract all of that. And as a result of that, the civil discourse in Malaysia, especially on social media, has become incredibly toxic. It's basically become poisoned, and like a lot of the discussions about how echo chambers and filter bubbles are sort of like starting to damage American sort of like political deliberation. That has already happened here, essentially. We are incredibly pessimistic. We're not really, we're so entrenched in the way that things work, essentially, that it's very, very difficult. But I think the only beacon of light that we have right now, essentially, is that, Facebook is considered to be a complete bot landscape now at this point. It's practically impossible to see who's authentic and who isn't, essentially. And I think in Twitter, it's a little bit more open, but again, a lot of the same issues are still present as well. So I suppose one of my big questions basically is that a lot of the issues with regards to the way that we engage with politics is heavily influenced by social media now at this point. And I know that the methodology for this report was focus mostly on media engagement, but I think in future iterations, or I think in more, I guess this can also extend towards the Freedom House's sort of like media freedom of the press report in the future, that social media sort of like effects also need to be taken into account, because they actually have a very strong way that they have a strong influence in the way that people treat the media in general as well. So that's sort of like something that I think should be worth looking into. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. Muhammad, why don't you give us a few tidbits on Indonesia if you have any thoughts?
All right. Before that, I just want to mention, I think Mr. Cameron was asking why we did not include the Asumsi channel in our report, because our research focuses between 2019 and 2021. And the Assumption Channel, the CHAG1 section was founded in February 2022. And that's why we did not include that in our report. Yeah, I think the relationship between China and Indonesia will grow further in the future. One of the reasons is because many of the projects, the Belt and Road Initiative project, are still ongoing, and many of them have been signed, even though there is not yet implementation. So I think the relationship will grow in the future. The big question is whether in 2024, after the election, the new presidency will also tend to be inclining toward China or having a new direction in the foreign policy. My suggestion is that Indonesia will continue to be dependent on China, and when it comes to the Chinese media influence, I think last year one of Australian Institute, Lowy Institute, produced a survey which shows that the image of China in Indonesia has been declining. So I think in the future, Chinese effort, whether it is media effort, educational effort, or cultural effort, will increase to make sure that positive image of China is still prevalent in Indonesia. So I think that's my thought about the future trajectory. And I think the use of social media will grow further. So I think there will be a move towards social media usage rather than traditional media usage in Chinese media influence in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muhammad. And thank you all. We've reached the end of the period for this conversation. It's been really interesting, and really appreciate everyone's thoughts and engagement. It's just so fascinating to see how all these different pieces come together across the countries in the region. I did post, BC and I posted the links to the report. You can see it on the Freedom House website. And we do actually have some translations up, and some translations will be coming. So we are hoping to have these available in the local languages, at least the main country reports. So Professor Gu, I'll turn it back to you. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say, but otherwise I think we're finished.
Okay, thank you for all participants for today. We have, I think, a great effort for today's briefing. So maybe it is okay to say goodbye and see you again. And thank you for thank you for the Freedom House. And maybe we will see you again. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and have a good night. Bye-bye.